Thank you for listening to the Chronicles of Christendom, a survey of medieval literature, by me, Mom Chilo. This podcast is dedicated to bringing light to medieval stories and viewing them from a traditional Christian perspective. I hope you enjoy this episode. La Vita Nuova by Dante Alighieri. If you know anything about Dante, you probably know him from Inferno, or maybe more generally the Commedia, which contains the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. However, what we're covering today is La Vita Nuova, which translates to something like the new life, or can also mean the youthful life. And we'll see how that ambiguity plays throughout the text. So this is a much earlier text from Dante than the comedy is. So the Divine Comedy is written like the early 1300s. This is a very much more younger work, or much more youthful work from Dante, and probably around the late 1200s. It is also a lot shorter than the comedy is. And in terms of genre and style, it's a bit strange. So it's kind of like a memoir or like an autobiography, but it's also like a poetry manual. So the way the text works is that he's kind of like giving a memoir of his life, but he's doing it through a series of poems he has written in his youth, and then he's filling in the details with prose. He says, "Look, okay, I wrote this poem, and then this, and this happened, and then I wrote this poem, and here's the significance of it, and then some of the background, details around it as well." So it's both prose and poetry, and we'll see how he combines these two genres together. It's also written in the vernacular, so it's not written in Latin, it's written in his dialect of Italian, like his vernacular dialect of Italian. Now, this entire work can be seen as a post hoc reflection on the significance of the woman Beatrice in his life. So even though he only encounters her a few times throughout his life, and he tells us all those times, we see that it's very significant for him, right? So significant, in fact, that later on in his life, when he writes the comedy, the Divine Comedy, in which he kind of tours heaven, he has this Beatrice, be his guide through paradise. In terms of translation, I'm going to be using the 1899 Rossetti translation. So this is an open source, free to use source. I'll put a link below. There is another translation that's also, it's not it's still in copyright, but it is freely available online by Frisardi. But I really don't like that translation. It's a lot more new, but it just doesn't have the same ring to it as the Rossetti translation does. So I'm just going to be using the Rossetti translation. But I'll include the Frisardi down below as well in case you want a more modern or contemporary translation. So the work starts with this. It says, "In that part of the book of my memory, before the which is little that can be read, there is a rubric saying, Incipit Vita Nuova. Under such rubric I find written many things, and among them the words which I propose to copy into this little book, if not all of them, at the least their substance." So Dante is saying that in his mind, there's a part of his mind or memory which says, here begins the new life, but it says it in Latin, and that he wants to copy down that part into this book. So the new life, or as I say, it can also be translated as the youthful life, is the part that he wants to copy down. And the reason why it might be the youthful life, or as well as the new life, is because he's talking about his life when he was a very young man. But he's also going to talk about some things in this work, this poem and prose work, that indicate how he gets a new life as well. So the work continues. 9 times already since my birth had the heaven of light returned to the self-same point, almost as concerns its own revolution, when first the glorious lady of my mind was made manifest to mine eyes, even she who was called Beatrice, by many who knew not wherefore. She had already been in this life for so long as that, within her time, the starry heaven had moved towards the eastern quarter 1 of the 12 parts of a degree, so that she appeared to me at the beginning of her 9th year almost, and I saw her almost at the end of my 9th year. Her dress on that day was of a most noble color, a subdued and goodly crimson, girdled and adorned in such sort as best suited with her very tender age. At that moment, I say most truly that the spirit of life, which hath its dwelling in the secretest chamber of the heart, began to tremble so violently that the least pulses of my body shook therewith, and in trembling it said these words. And then there's a Latin phrase which translates to, "Here is a deity stronger than I, who coming shall rule over me." At that moment, the animate spirit which dwelt in the lofty chamber whither all the senses carry their perceptions, was filled with wonder, and speaking more especially unto the spirit of the eyes, said these words. And then there's another Latin phrase, and it translates to, "Your beatitude hath now been made manifest unto you." At that moment, the natural spirit which dwelleth there where our nourishment is administered began to weep, and in weeping said these words, which is another Latin phrase which translates to, "Woe is me, for that often I shall be disturbed from this time forth." So at 9 years old, Dante first encounters Beatrice, and we see even as a child how she has such a huge impact on him. He later says that ever since he saw her, that from that time forward, love quite governed my soul. So he gets absolutely enamored with this woman, but not enamored in a physical sense, right? I mean, they're only 9 years old at this time, and later on, even as they get older and they're become of age, there's nothing really physical implied whatsoever. In fact, there's even a few times where he says, "Look, this might sound physical, but I do not mean it in any physical or like carnal way whatsoever." So he's very clear about that throughout the entire story. So this enamoration is something more than just carnal desire. It's something greater than that, much more spiritual. So he uses language like beatitude, and that's actually a play on words of her name. So her name is Beatrice, and in the English, we even see that there's a sort of a play on words between beatitude and Beatrice, and that sort of relationship is even more distinct or more obvious in the Italian. You may have also noticed how often the number 9 appeared just in that paragraph that I read. So when they first saw each other, he was 9 years old and she was also 9 years old. The number 9 is going to appear quite a lot throughout the story in kind of weird ways, or ways that we wouldn't necessarily think as significant in our modern viewpoint. And Dante is going to comment later on kind of some of the symbolism behind the number 9. But as a sort of teaser, in the Divine Comedy, where Beatrice is Dante's guide through paradise, Saint Dionysius the Areopagite calls Beatrice the youngest of all the angels. And this is significant because Saint Dionysius the Areopagite, in his compilation of works, he demarcates the 9 ranks of angels for the first time. It really systematizes like angelology. So a little later on he says, "Albeit her image that was with me always was an exaltation of love to subdue me, it was yet of so perfect a quality that it never allowed me to be overruled by love without the faithful counsel of reason, whensoever such counsel was useful to be heard." So this is important because a lot of the poets at this time, including the poets that Dante is friends with and is in the same sort of milieu with, we could say, there's a lot of debate about love. Like, what is love? What are some of its aspects or qualities? Is it rational? Is it irrational? Is it good? Is it bad? Sort of things of that nature. Things poets are kind of obsessed with stereotypically, right? And Dante here is putting his foot down, and he's saying that love is not irrational. Reason and love, in fact, are united together. Reason and love go together. They're not separate. The other implicit argument that he's making here, and he does it more so throughout the entire text as a whole, is that love is also not just some like high-flung abstract ideal, but in some sense it is very like incarnational. And we're going to see how he views love as incarnational through the figure of Beatrice. So 9 years after this first encounter that he has with Beatrice, he sees her again. So again, 9 years later, right in the number 9. So it reads, "She saluted me with so virtuous a bearing that I seemed then and there to behold the very limits of blessedness. The hour of her most sweet salutation was exactly the 9th of that day. And because it was the first time that any words from her reached mine ears, I came into such sweetness that I parted thence as one intoxicated." So the other play on words I want to bring up is, so earlier I brought up, Beatrice and beatitude, or like beatifier, but there's also salutation or like salute and salvation. It kind of works in English, but again, it's much more obvious in the Italian. And we see this enamoration that he has with her, where even it's the first time that they've ever spoken, right? So she says basically just hi to him or hello or whatever it is, and he becomes intoxicated, we're told. And then later that day, he has this vision. So he says, I fell to thinking of this most courteous lady, thinking of whom I was overtaken by a pleasant slumber, wherein a marvelous vision was presented to me. For there appeared to be in my room a mist of the color of fire, within the which I discerned the figure of a lord of terrible aspect to such as should gaze upon him, but who seemed therewithal to rejoice inwardly that it was a marvel to see. Speaking, he said many things, among the which I could understand but few, and of these this, ego dominus tuus, so that's Latin for I am your master. In his arms it seemed to me that a person was sleeping, covered with a blood-colored cloth, upon whom, looking very attentively, I knew that it was a lady of this salutation who had deigned the day before to salute me. And he held her also in his hand a thing that was burning in flames, and he said to me, Vide cor tuum, which means, behold thy heart. By when he had remained with me a little while, I thought he set himself to awaken her that slept, after the which he made her to eat that thing which flamed in his hand, and she ate as one fearing. Then having waited again a space, all his joy was turned into most bitter weeping, and as she wept he gathered the lady into his arms, and it seemed to me that he went with her up towards heaven, whereby such a great anguish came upon me, that my light slumber could not endure through it, but was suddenly broken. And immediately having considered, I knew that the hour wherein this vision had made manifest to me was the 4th hour, which is to say, the first of the 9 last hours of the night. So this might sound quite strange, and it kind of is, right? So God is essentially holding Beatrice, and she's covered in this blood-colored cloth. It might be the same cloth, like the crimson-colored cloth that was mentioned earlier, that she was wearing. And God has in his hand Dante's heart that's like flaming. And then he makes Beatrice eat Dante's heart. And then they go up towards heaven. So this is some weird imagery, right? However, there is some precedent for this imagery. So in the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel eats a scroll that was given to him. And also in the book of Revelation, there's another instance of St. John eating a scroll as well. And there will be later hagiographical accounts of people eating scrolls. Most famously, we have the story of St. Romanos eating a scroll and then receiving this divine wisdom in order to chant a beautiful hymn to the Theotokos. So although this isn't eating a heart per se, this idea of eating weird things isn't necessarily outside of the Christian worldview, right? And then most famously we have the Eucharist and Eucharistic imagery. So I think one of the things that the story is trying to do with this vision is to show the connection between Beatrice and Dante. How even though they might not be like friends really, there is this sort of special connection between them that is like the spiritual connection, you might say. So after describing the event in prose, he then describes or he reproduces the poem that he wrote when this originally happened. And it says, To every heart which the sweet pain doth move, and unto which these words may now be brought, for true interpretation and kind thought be greeting in our Lord's name, which is love. Of those long hours wherein the stars above wake and keep watch, the third was almost not, when love was shown me with such terrors fraught, as may not carelessly be spoken of. He seemed like one who was full of joy, and had my heart within his hand, and on his arm my lady with the mantle around her slept, whom, having wakened her anon, he made to eat that heart. She ate, as fearing harm. Then he went out, and as he went, he wept. So after some time, we're told how Dante starts to, how he describes it, is he describes it as he feigns attraction towards another woman in order for people not to know about his infatuation or his views of Beatrice. And it might just be the case that he's reinterpreting his past, right, where he had a relationship, or maybe he liked another woman or whatever, and now he's reinterpreting it post hoc as, oh, that was just myself trying to hide the secret so people wouldn't find out what I think about Beatrice. But anyways, this lady, who he calls the Screen Lady, moves away, and then while he's traveling, he meets, or rather, he has this vision of Love, and Love tells him to find another Screen Lady. And then after the vision, he says this: "It seemed to me that love became a part of myself, so that, changed as it were in mine aspect, I rode on full of thought the whole of that day, and with heavy sighing. And the day being over, I wrote this sonnet. A day agone, as I rode suddenly upon a certain path that liked me not, I met Love midway while the air was hot, clothed lightly as a wayfarer might be. And for the cheer he showed, he seemed to me as one who hath lost lordship he had got, advancing towards me full of sorrowful thought, bowing his forehead so that none should see. Then as I went, he called me by my name, saying, I journey since the morn was dim, thence where I made thy heart to be, which now I needs must bear unto another dame. Wherewith so much passed into me of him that he was gone, and I discerned not how." So he has this encounter with Love and becomes even more entwined with Love. He says Love became a part of himself. So he listens to Love, and then he goes back, he returns home, and he makes a new lady his Screen Lady in order to protect the idea that, or protect the notion that he likes or has this relationship with Beatrice, right? So because of this, because he gets a new lady almost like immediately after his old one leaves, he gets a reputation as like a player. And people begin to spread rumors about Dante. And because of this, when he bumps into Beatrice again, she actually denies him her greeting. I will go on to relate that when, for the first time, this beatitude was denied me, I became possessed with such grief that, parting myself from others, I went into a lonely place to bathe the ground with most bitter tears. And when by this heat of weeping I was somewhat relieved, I betook myself to my chamber, where I could lament unheard. And in the midst of his grief, he has a vision of Love again, and Love tells him this: Our Beatrice hath feared from certain persons that the lady whom I named to thee while thou journeyedst full of sighs is sorely disquieted by thy solicitations. And therefore this most gracious creature, who is the enemy of all disquiet, being fearful of such disquiet, refused to salute thee. For the reason which, albeit in very sooth, thy secret must needs have become known to her by familiar observation. So Love essentially tells Dante, look, she's only denying you her greeting because of what I told you to do. So don't really worry too much about it. And then he tells him to write some poetry about what has happened. He then attends this wedding where Beatrice is present at. And the implication seems to be that it's actually Beatrice who is getting married here, but he doesn't really say it explicitly. But anyways, so he says, And when I perceived her, all my senses were overpowered by the great lordship that Love obtained, finding himself so near unto that most gracious being, until nothing but the spirits of sight remained to me, and even these remained driven out of their own instruments, because Love entered in that honored place of theirs, so that he might the better behold her. And although I was other than at first, I grieved for the spirits so expelled, which kept up a sore lament, saying, If he had not in his wise thrust us forth, we also should behold the marvel of this lady. So at this wedding, when he sees her, he goes into this ecstatic state. And we're told that even his vision, although he still had vision, that was his last sense that was left, vision was overtaken by Love, because Love wanted to see and behold Beatrice. And this has a lot to do with the Catholic notion of heaven or paradise, or a part of it, or at least a big part of it, consists of the beatific vision, where essentially you just look at God. That's a little bit simplistic. However, that's the most important thing to note about it. So we have this idea that Beatrice, in some sense, is kind of like God. In fact, maybe we could say that she's a Christological image of Christ, right? Where even Love himself wants to look upon Beatrice because she is such a noble creature. So while he's just kind of frozen, really, and just looking at her, Beatrice's friends begin to make fun of him And then one of Dante's friends has to pull him out, and he asks him, like, bro, like, what the heck's happening with you? Like, what's wrong with you, Dante? But Dante just kind of stares at him until he says this kind of a cryptic line. Of a surety, I have now set my feet on that point of life, beyond the which he must not pass who would return. And then he recounts the poem that he wrote after this event, and this is how the poem goes. The thoughts are broken in my memory, thou lovely joy, whenever I see thy face. When thou art near me, love fills up the space, often repeating, if death irk thee, fly. My face shows my heart's color verily, which, fainting, seeks for any leaning place, till in the drunken terror of disgrace, the very stones seem to be shrieking, die. If it were a grievous sin, if one should not, strive then to comfort my bewildered mind, though merely with a simple pitying, for the great anguish which thy scorn was wrought, and the dead sight o' the eyes grown nearly blind, which look for death as for a blessed thing. So then, and this is, this seems to be like at least some days later, he's walking around the city and he runs into a bunch of Beatrice's friends. Beatrice isn't there, but one of the ladies addresses Dante and she says, to what end lovest thou this lady, seeing that thou canst not support her presence? Now tell us this thing, that we may know it, for certainly the end of such a love must be worthy of knowledge. And then Dante replies, ladies, the end and aim of my love was but the salutation of that lady, of whom I conceive that ye are speaking, wherein alone I found that beatitude which is the goal of desire. And now that it hath pleased her to deny me this, love, my master, of his great goodness, hath placed all my beatitude there where my hope will not fail me. And then they respond, we pray thee that thou wilt tell us wherein abideth this thy beatitude. And answering, I said but thus much, in those words that do praise my lady. So he's telling Beatrice's friends that he received a certain beatitude from Beatrice. However, since she has denied him now, love, his master, has given Dante a new place where his hope of beatitude will not fail. And then he explains that the place is poems or words praising Beatrice. And then he writes a long poem after this interaction. I won't read the whole thing, but I'll read part of it. He says, or he writes, my lady is desired in the high heaven, wherefore it now behoveth me to tell, saying, let any maid that would be well esteemed keep with her, for as she goes by, into foul hearts a deathly chill is driven, by love that makes ill thought to perish there, while any who endures to gaze on her must either be ennobled or else die. When one deserving to be raised so high is found, 'tis then her power attains its proof, making his heart strong for his soul's behoof, with the full strength of meek humility. Also this virtue owns she by God's will, who speaks with her can never come to ill. Love saith concerning her, how chance it that flesh, which is of dust, should be thus pure? So we learn a couple of things. So one is that this idea that when you gaze upon Beatrice, you gaze upon this heavenly object, that you are ennobled by it, or if you're not ennobled by it, then you just die. So there's a lot of theological precedent for this sort of notion, right? Where, God's grace or God's power is, good for some people, but it's bad for others. Or maybe you can think of God's judgment. It's, it's very good if, you're a good person who's been abused in this world. However, if you're a bad person who's been abusing people, then that same judgment of God's isn't going to be so good for you, right? It's that same sort of concept. And then the other important thing is that he makes this notion, or he suggests this notion, that matter isn't necessarily pure evil, right? So even though Beatrice is material, she's of dust, she is a human, right? She's not even though she's called an angel, it's not meant like angel as in not human. It just means she's like the angels, right? So what Dante is saying here is that the matter isn't necessarily evil, and that really good things can come out of dust, out of flesh. It's a very incarnational view of love that doesn't deny the matter or the material world. So then he tells a story about how one of his friends, probably one of his poet friends, asks him to write about love, like kind of explain what love is. So he writes this poem in response. So Dante writes, "Love and the gentle heart are one same thing, even as the wise man in his ditty saith, each of itself would be such life and death, as rational soul bereft of reasoning. 'Tis nature makes them when she loves a king. Love is, whose palace where he sojourneth is called the heart. There draws he quiet breath, at first with brief or longer slumbering. Then beauty seen in virtuous womankind will make the eyes desire, and through the heart send the desiring of the eyes again, where often it abides so long enshrined, that love at length out of his sleep will start, and women feel the same for worthy men." So Dante is positing that love and the gentle heart are the same thing. And then he also posits some other things about love, how there's like this natural attraction and desire that occurs with love. But notice that he doesn't put it in any sort of carnal or sexual terms. While that might be implicit, but it's not a necessary condition, we could say, for love. Also, that's a very positive view of love. It's not like love isn't seen as this negative thing that it sometimes was, especially in the poetic tradition and parts of Europe around this time, where it's something that like compels you or like forces you and makes you do things that you're not really supposed to do, and it's like this like illness almost that you have to overcome. Like people talk about being lovesick. Well, Dante's ideal of like what true like the ideal love is very different from those notions of love, which a lot of poets were writing about in this time, both in Italy and also in France, especially with the troubadour tradition, which comes to Italy a little bit later and influences not necessarily Dante per se, but a lot of the people in Dante's like poetic milieu. So then Dante says, "It appeared to me that I should also say something in praise of my lady, where it might be set forth how love manifested itself when produced by her, and how not only she could awaken it where it slept, but where it was not she could marvelously create it, to which end I wrote another sonnet, and it is this. My lady carries love within her eyes, all that she looks on is made pleasanter. Upon her path men turn to gaze at her, he whom she greeteth feels his heart rise, and droops his troubled visage full of sighs, and of his evil heart is then aware, hate loves, and pride becomes a worshipper. O women, help to praise her in some wise, humbleness, and the hope that hopeth well, by speech of hers into the mind are brought, and who beholds is blessed often whiles. The look she hath when she a little smiles cannot be said nor holden in the thought. 'Tis such a new and gracious miracle." So when he's talking about Beatrice here, he talks about how she's able to manifest love and produce love, and she even awakens it where it is slept, and where love is not sleeping, where love is totally absent, she's able to create it as if, in some sort of miraculous act. So again, it's another positive view of love, and it's also love as this creative force. So eventually, Beatrice's father passes away, and then Dante is found crying, and people remark that you would think it was his own father who had died. And then 9 days later, again, the 9 numerology symbolism here, 9 days later, he has another vision. And in this vision, he has another view of Beatrice being dead, just like at the very beginning of the story. And he realizes that Beatrice, as a mortal, must one day die. So he says, "Then, feeling bewildered, I closed mine eyes, and my brain began to be in travail as the brain of one fanatic, and to have such imaginations here as follow. And at the first it seemed to me that I saw certain faces of women with their hair loosened, which called out to me, Thou shalt surely die. After the which other terrible and unknown appearances said unto me, Thou art dead. While I wondered in my trance and was filled with a grievous fear, I conceived that a certain friend came unto me and said, Hast thou not heard? She that was thine excellent lady hath been taken out of life. Then I began to weep very piteously, and not only in my imagination, but with my eyes, which were wet with tears." And I'm going to read part of the poem, which he writes after the fact. So he says, describing his vision or his trance that he was in, "And I became so humble in my grief, seeing her in such deep humility, that I said, Death, I hold thee passing good. Henceforth, in a most gentle sweet relief, since my dear love has chosen to dwell with thee. Pity, not hate, is thine, well understood. So we see that because like Dante's like an actual Christian who like believes in the resurrection, right? And like has this ultimately positive eschatological outlook. When he talks about death or like the personification of death, he talks about it in very almost like positive ways. He says, "Death, I hold thee passing good," because he knows that Beatrice is this like holy lady. When she passes, he knows that she's going to go into paradise, right? It's going to be a good for her. She's going to go into a better life. So when he talks about death, well, he doesn't say death in and of itself is good, right? Because obviously death is like this aspect of our fallen world. But he says that Beatrice's death, in some sense, is good because she's going into a better place, a most gentle, sweet relief, as he calls it. Now, compare this to, say, the plowman, which we covered a while ago, where, there's also the personification of death, but there's no real, like, mention of, like, the paradise or heaven or any of these other things. Like, they might be somewhat mentioned, but there's not a real, like, eschatological optimism that you would expect from, like, ostensible Christians. So then he writes, "After this empty imagining, it happened on a day, as I sat thoughtful, that I was taken with such a strong trembling at the heart that it could not have been otherwise in the presence of my lady. Whereupon I perceived that there was an appearance of love beside me, and I seemed to see him coming from my lady. And he said, not aloud, but within my heart, Now take heed that thou bless the day when I entered into thee, for it is fitting that thou should do so." So Love tells Dante to be grateful for the day when love entered into him. And then after, he says, "I saw coming towards me a certain lady who was very famous for her beauty, and of whom that friend whom I have already called the first among my friends had long been enamored. That lady's right name was Joan, but because of her comeliness, or at least it was so imagined, she was called by many Primavera, which means spring. It went by that name among them. Then looking again, I perceived that the most noble Beatrice followed after her. And when both these ladies had passed by me, it seemed to me that love spake again in my heart, saying, She that came first was called Spring, only because of that which was to happen on this day. And it was I myself who caused that name to be given her, seeing that as the spring cometh first in the year, so should she come first on this day, when Beatrice was to show herself after the vision of her servant." So love here, which is like God, essentially, is saying that, look, I want to show you how much I'm in charge of these things that are going on, that I'm going to like show some real deep symbolism to you, like real symbolism happening, like in real time happening to you. And you're going to see this lady whose name is Primavera, which means spring, but it's also a play on words in Italian, meaning like she who comes first, who's going to come before Beatrice comes following behind her. And then there's the other layer of symbolism here of her name being Joan, which is like the feminine form of John, as in John the Baptist, right? And John the Baptist famously says, I come before Jesus. I'm the one who's supposed to come first. That's why he's often called like the forerunner. And this further adds to like the Christological type or like the Jesus imagery that's associated with Beatrice, right? So if her friend Joan or John is supposed to be John the Baptist, then she is like Jesus. And it also shows really how he's viewing history and even his own personal history in these very deeply allegorical terms. He's seeing like symbolism happen. So now Dante kind of changes a little bit of his tone or his topic, and he makes a defense, like a philosophical defense, for the way that he talks about love. So he says, "It might be here objected unto me, and even by one worthy of controversy, that I have spoken of love as though it were a thing outward and invisible, not only a spiritual essence, but as a bodily substance also." So he's saying, look, many people might criticize me because I have spoken of love as if it's a physical thing and not just like an immaterial like emotion. And then he recounts in Aristotelian terms, and Aristotelianism was really rising up in Western Europe at this time. It had a big resurgence at this time, especially with people like Thomas Aquinas, who Dante was familiar with, because there was this new wave of like translations and scholarship that was coming into Western Europe from mostly Islamic and Arabic sources. So he's defending himself in these Aristotelian terms, and that he admits that he's speaking as if love is a substance and not merely an accident of a substance. However, he's saying that he's only doing that because of poetic license. He's using poetic license to prove a point with the way he's speaking of love. And then to bolster his defense, he cites, some of the canonical poets like Virgil and Ovid, who also have inanimate things speak as if they're animate. So he's saying if they can do it, so also can I. And he's like, look, I understand that love isn't like love in and of itself isn't like a material thing. However, because I'm a poet, this is how we like communicate with people. So it's interesting to see that like Dante in like the late 1200s is having to go out of his way to explain why he's using like this allegorical language, like this poetic language. And I find that very interesting as almost like a sign of what's to come later on in the West, where people almost totally forget how to do allegory. And they can only think in these materialist terms. It's not too bad yet, but there's already some, I guess you could say, inklings of that occurring here that Dante has to defend himself against. So after he's done making his defense of his allegorical language, he goes back to writing and talking about Joan. And then he does this interesting thing, at least like from like a literary standpoint, where he's writing this poem, right? He's getting some lines down, and then the poem breaks off, and then he says, I was still occupied with this poem, having composed myself thereof, only the above written stanza, when the Lord God of justice called my most gracious lady unto himself, that she might be glorious under the banner of that blessed Queen Mary, whose name had always a deep reverence in the words of holy Beatrice. So we have this poem that breaks off in the middle, and then we see or we hear about Beatrice's death. So it really shows the rupture that Beatrice's death has on Dante's life, and he conveys it in a very interesting way. Something I don't think I've seen medieval people do. This this is a very modern thing, but I think Dante's doing this in the 1200s, where like the part of the story within the story breaks off, and you see this interjection of Beatrice's death, which really goes to show how much of an impact Beatrice's death had on Dante. And Dante also says that he's really not going to write too much about her death, and he gives a couple of reasons why. But it essentially boils down to that like this death is like a mystery, and he doesn't really feel it's appropriate to write about it. And also, in a sense, going back to the way that Dante uses allegorical language, because as he said several times throughout this poem, because he knows that Beatrice is going to go into paradise, go into heaven, it would be weird. Again, this is not Dante, this is me, but I'm speaking on behalf of Dante or trying to interpret this story. I think it would be weird if he talked too much about her like physical carnal death, because he's already talked so much about how she's going into a new and better life once she dies. So why talk about her death when her death is her just going into a better place? Why dwell on the bad? But he will talk about how the number 9 appeared regarding her death. So he says, I say then that according to the division of time in Italy, her most noble spirit departed from us in the first hour of the 9th day of the month, according to the division of time in Syria in the 9th month of the year. Seeing that Tismim, which with us is in October, is there the first month. Also, she was taken from among us in that year of our reckoning, to which of the years of our Lord, in which the perfect number was 9 times multiplied within that century wherein she was born into the world, which is to say, the 13th century of Christians. So then he wants to explain why the number 9 was so connected with her, not only in her death, but also throughout her life. And he says that according to Ptolemy, and also to the Christian verity, the revolving heavens are 9, and according to the common opinion among astrologers, these 9 heavens together have influence over the earth. Wherefore, it would appear that this number 9 was thus allied unto her for the purpose of signifying that, at her birth, all these 9 heavens were at perfect unity with each other as to their influence. And then he goes a little bit more, but then he says like a really key thing here. He says, thus, 3 being of itself the efficient of 9, and the great efficient of miracles being of himself 3 persons, to wit, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which being 3 are also one, This lady was accompanied by the number 9 to the end that men might clearly perceive her to be a 9, that is, a miracle, whose only root is the Holy Trinity. So there's a lot of 9 symbolism and numerology going on, but some of the important ones that I find is the idea of like the 9 and the heavens, right? Like the 9 ranks of angels, and the angels are associated with like the stars and the heavens, right? And they have influence over the earth, in the same way that Beatrice also had influence over the earth as well. And then there's the continued Christological allegory or typology going on, where Beatrice is likened to God or likened to Jesus, and we see that with the Trinity, and how the Trinity 3 times 3 of the Trinity equals 9. So I said that this poem is very modern in many ways, but then we have this numerology, which makes it very medieval. It's a lot like how the church fathers talk about numbers in the Bible, where they make, at least according to us in the modern world, they make these very weird connections that you wouldn't necessarily see. And you really think that they're stretching, but they're doing something that, as modern people, we just don't really do that often, so we have a hard time understanding numerology. And as you can imagine, this death has quite an impact on Dante, so of course he writes a poem, and it's very long. It's like the longest of all the poems in this work, I believe, but I'll just read a couple parts that I found interesting. So he writes, "And I will say, still sobbing as speech fails, that she hath gone to heaven suddenly, and hath left love below to mourn with me. Beatrice is gone up into high heaven, the kingdom where the angels are at peace, and lives with them, and to her friends is dead. Not by the frost of winter was she driven away like others, nor by summer heats, but through a perfect gentleness instead. For from the lamp of her meek lowly head such an exceeding glory went up hence, that it woke wonder in the eternal Sire, until a sweet desire entered him for that lovely excellence, so that he bade her to himself aspire, counting this weary most evil place unworthy of a thing so full of grace." So in these very poetic terms, Dante's making it clear that Beatrice is going up into heaven and that she's in a better place. And for a moment here, Dante kind of takes the perspective of God, who's called, at least in this translation, the eternal Sire, like the eternal Father, you could say. And then from his perspective, he's saying that this lady is so full of grace that she doesn't deserve to live on this earth anymore, which is called an evil place, and that she needs to go up into heaven. So, like, the Lord calls her because she is so full of grace. And I'll read the ending of the poem. He writes, "Afterward, calling with a sore lament on Beatrice, I ask, canst thou be dead? In calling on her I am comforted. Grief with its tears and anguish with its sighs come to me now whenever I am alone, so that I think the sight of me gives pain, and what my life hath been that living dies, since for my lady the new birth's begun. I have not any language to explain, and so, dear ladies, though my heart fain, I scarce could tell indeed how I am thus. All joy is with my bitter life at war, yea, I am fallen so far, that all men seem to say, go out from us. I and my cold white lips, how dead they are, but she, though I be bowed unto the dust, watches me, and will gird in me, I trust. Weep, pitiful song of mine, upon thy way, to the dames going and the demoiselles, for whom and for none else. Thy sisters have made music many a day. Thou that art very sad and not as they, go dwell thou with them as a mourner dwells." The way that he describes Beatrice's death, he says, "For my lady, the new birth's begun." So this is kind of related to the title of this poem called like the new life or the youthful life. So it's the question of, is Dante getting a new life because of his interaction with Beatrice and that original interaction and salutation that he received from her? Or is it also referring to Beatrice's new life when she's called up into heaven? A year after Beatrice's death, Dante is drawing angels. And as he's drawing these angels, this is what he says. He says, "I lifted my eyes to look, and then perceived a young and very beautiful lady, who was gazing upon me from a window with a gaze full of pity, so that the very sum of pity appeared gathered together in her. And seeing that unhappy persons, when they beget compassion in others, are then most moved unto weeping, as though they also felt pity for themselves, it came to pass that my eyes, began to be inclined unto tears. Wherefore, becoming fearful lest I should make manifest mine abject condition, I rose up and went out where I could not be seen of that lady, saying afterwards within myself, certainly with her also must my most noble love abide. He then seems to develop some sort of like romantic relationship with this woman, and he writes a couple of love poems about her. And there's a really good chance that this is his wife, Gemma Donati. There's a biography about Dante that's by a contemporary of his sort of, and it says that Dante got married to Gemma Donati about 1 year after Beatrice's death. So this timeline would kind of line up there. But anyways, he writes all these love poems about this lady, and then Dante starts to have some mixed feelings about this girl though. So on one side, he says it's love's messenger to help him find peace. But another says that this lady is just distracting him from Beatrice. And then he has this vision of Beatrice herself. There rose up in me on a certain day, Dante writes, about the 9th hour, again 9 numerology, a strong visible fantasy, wherein I seemed to behold the most gracious Beatrice, habited in that crimson raiment which she had worn when I had first beheld her. Also, she appeared to me of that same tender age as them, whereupon I fell into a deep thought of her, and my memory ran back, according to the order of time, unto all those matters in the which she had borne a part. And my heart began painfully to repent of the desire by which it had so basely let itself be possessed during so many days, contrary to the constancy of reason. And then, this evil desire being quite gone from me, all my thoughts turned again unto their excellent Beatrice. And I say most truly that from that hour I thought constantly of her with a whole humbled and ashamed heart, the which became often manifest in sighs that had among them the name of that most gracious creature, and how she departed from us. So Dante is seeing this girl. He has some sort of relationship with another woman. It's not clear what exactly is going on. The poem is very vague about that. However, there are a couple of hints. Anyways, he then gets this vision of Beatrice, and it says that his heart began to painfully to repent of the desire by which it had so basely let itself be possessed during so many days, contrary to the constancy of reason. And then it says that his heart turns again towards Beatrice. Now, one way to read this would be something like, oh, he's developed some sort of romantic relationship with another girl, but then Beatrice appears to him, and then he stops that relationship. But the reading that I'm inclined towards is not so much that the problem is that Dante has a relationship with like another woman per se. Instead, I think that the problem is that the relationship that Dante had with that woman was somehow awry, or at least it had like, bad foundation, shall we say. Like they were probably maybe having like premarital sex or something like that. Or there was like lust in Dante's heart, because later on, he also says that the vision of Beatrice also prevented him from looking upon the beauty of any face that might again bring them to shame and evil. And then just in general, the idea of like repentance makes me think that he was doing something sinful with the woman in question. So when it says that he turned again towards Beatrice, it means that he stopped doing the thing that was sinful, not necessarily that he like totally cut off that woman. And again, this would make sense because we know Dante got married around this time, and that he's also speaking very allegorically as well. And if Beatrice is to represent some form of like purity and like sanctity, then it could also be a way of saying that Dante turned away from sin and towards purity and sanctity himself. This also would lend credence to the idea that some of those rumors that were being spread about Dante of him being kind of like a ladies' man or a player actually had some weight to them, and that seeing Beatrice or these visions of Beatrice helped him to really change his life in that way. So now I'll read the last sonnet that Dante has in this work. He says, "Beyond the sphere which spreads to widest space, now soars the sigh that my heart sends above. A new perception born of grieving love, guided it up towards the untrodden ways. When it hath reached unto the end and stays, it sees a lady round whom splendors move, in homage till, by the great light thereof, abashed the pilgrim spirit stands at gaze. It sees her such, that when it tells me this which it hath seen, I understand it not. It hath the speech so subtile and so fine, and yet I know its voice within my thought. often remembereth me of Beatrice, so that I understand it, ladies mine. So I would probably consider this some form of like apocalyptic vision that Dante is receiving, where he's like seeing like heaven in a sense, and he's just describing it in poetic terms, and he sees that in heaven there is also Beatrice, and there's also all these other wonderful things that he can only describe in this kind of lofty language. So immediately after writing the sonnet, he says, "After writing the sonnet, it was given unto me to behold a very wonderful vision, wherein I saw things which determined me that I would say nothing further of this most blessed one, until such time as I could discourse more worthily concerning her. And to this end I labor all I can, as she well knoweth. Wherefore, if it be his pleasure, through whom is the life of all things, that my life continue with me a few years, it is my hope that I shall yet write concerning her, that hath not been before written of any woman. After the which, may it seem good unto him who is the master of grace, that my spirit should go hence to behold the glory of its lady, to wit, of that blessed Beatrice, who now gazeth continually on his countenance, who is blessed unto the ages of ages." The end. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed and got something out of this. This was a kind of challenging text for me to read. I had to read this text much more intently and deeply and many more times, frankly, than I do for some other text. But I hope you're able to get something out of this. And again, y'all, this isn't a comprehensive deep dive into the text. It's just a cursory overview. If I were to do a more comprehensive thing, it would probably be 4 to 5 hours long. But just know that there's a lot more going on in this text that I had to skip over, or that I didn't go too much into, or that I myself was simply confused. So I hope this gives you the enthusiasm to read it yourself and maybe gain something from it that I didn't. Thank you so much.